Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. In previous videos, I've covered tracing the pattern, laying out and cutting the fabric, and transferring the pattern markings to the fabric. Now, I have a pile of stuff cut out, and it's important to know where to begin. Start with the directions. The problem is many directions are lacking critical information, some very basic steps and sequencing that may be critical to working with hand-woven fabric. Each of the patterns that I sell come with step-by-step directions, which are available separately from the actual patterns. The patterns, of course, have a price, but the directions are always free as downloads. Even if you're making a jacket with someone else's patterns, consider downloading the directions for mine because I cover more steps than most pattern directions will show. Here are the directions for my 200 jacket, all 31 pages. I've cut out 2 jackets, one from hand-woven fabric, which is a little busy and probably won't show up well for the camera. These are the leftovers from the coat that's on the dress form behind me. The other jacket is cut from a length of Harris tweed. Harris tweed wool from Scotland, which was given to me by a guild member's husband. He had always intended to have a sport jacket made, but decided that I'd make better use of this gorgeous piece of wool. I think he would be happy that it's being used for educational purposes as well. In both cases, I've chosen to create a welt pocket instead of the traditional patch pocket that comes with the 200 jacket pattern. The welt pocket is a variation. Directions and replacement pages for my 100 jacket, my 200 jacket, and the 800 vest pattern that show positioning of the welt are available in my eShop along with the rest of my pattern collection. The link, of course, will be in the show notes below. I've chosen linings for both jackets, and I've cut those out as well. All the components are in a pile waiting to be sewn. For the Harris tweed jacket, I'm using a hand-painted cotton fabric, which of course is from my stash. As with most fabrics in my stash, I have no idea where I purchased it. For the hand-woven fabric, I found this gorgeous old kimono that had been carefully taken apart. I do remember where I purchased that. It was a lovely shop called Jan McGregor Studio, featuring Japanese antiques on Whidbey Island in Washington State. A burn test showed the kimono was indeed silk. The painting on it is gorgeous, and the scraps made beautiful bias, which I'll use for a seam finish later in the video. So let's get started. My directions always start with recommended stitch length for handwovens, which I have covered in a separate video, Working with Handwoven Fabrics, the Sewing Basics. The next step is always about stay stitching, what it is, where to put it, and which direction to sew. I've covered grain lines and which direction to sew in a previous video on finishing the edges of the cloth once you've cut out the garment, if the garment requires that step. In both of these jackets, stabilizing the edges was not necessary. They're both wool and slightly fulled, and the edges will hold together just fine during the construction process. So I'll begin with stay stitching. I would do an entire video on this step because it's so important, but I've already filmed one for Threads magazine, which is part of their basics video and therefore free. Please watch that video first. It contains some really valuable information about why stay stitching is necessary and how stay stitching is executed. There is a link for that video in the show notes and also in the instructions for the jacket. So for brevity, I'll just summarize. Here is the back and one front of the Harris tweed jacket. Using a normal stitch length, in this case 10 stitches to the inch or 2.5 centimeter, I'll be stitching just inside the seam line, a 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters from the cut edge, in the direction of the grain. And we summarized that in the previous video by illustrating stitching widest to narrowest and highest to lowest. On the back of the jacket, we will be stitching from the neckline to the armhole across the shoulder, highest to lowest. And we will be stay stitching the neck edge from shoulder to center back and from the opposite shoulder to the center back. The front neck edge is shaped differently, of course. So in addition to stitching from the neckline to the armhole across the shoulder, highest to lowest, we will also be stitching starting at the bottom of the front neckline and moving towards the shoulder, widest to narrowest. I just want to take a minute to point something out because there were some questions about this in one of my previous videos. So my machine is up here on top of my cutting table for video purposes. I'm actually standing and my presser foot's way down there on the floor. It will reach. But my normal method for sewing is that I'm on a slightly reduced workbench that I can get this in a proper alignment with my glasses and my back, and I'm in a secretary's chair. So this isn't the actual setup for sewing. Unfortunately, that area is behind the camera and we can't light it properly. This is so much better for video purposes. Though both of these jackets will be lined, one of my recommendations for working with hand-woven fabrics is leaving the lining hanging free so that it doesn't interfere with any growth of the cloth. I will cover linings more extensively in a later video, but for now, know that because the lining will remain loose and unattached at the hem, the seams inside should look really polished. And I'm going to show you how to really polish the inside. This technique will also, or this seam finish will also be appropriate for unlined jackets and vests as well. The type of seam finish that I'm going to demonstrate is called a Hong Kong seam finish. It was first introduced by tailors in Hong Kong as a way of streamlining the construction of a tailored men's jacket by finishing the seams of the jacket, half lining across the back and sleeve linings were all that was necessary for the final product. The difficulty is that we still refer to this seam finish as a Hong Kong seam finish. And with the discussion in all industries about the appropriation of culturally specific terms, I'm not sure what to call this seam finish anymore. It's not a bound seam, and that's something completely different. I suppose bias edge finish could work, but that term is usually used for the bias edge treatment of a neckline or an armhole, which is used in the instruction of my 900 bias top and 1000 swing dress patterns. And so, with apologies for using a potentially culturally appropriated term, I will now talk about the Hong Kong seam finish. There are endless tutorials on YouTube for applying a Hong Kong seam finish, and I'm going to talk specifically about how to get the best results on hand-woven fabric. Most importantly is applying the binding before you sew the seam. It's really difficult and annoying to apply the binding once the seam is sewn. And hand-woven fabric gets more ravelly the more you handle it, so it makes sense to secure those edges as one of the first steps. This is the Hong Kong seam finish as used in an unlined jacket. It is beautiful. It's clean. In this case, I used a fine linen here. And as you can see, this is gorgeous. It's gorgeous. My instructions tell you when and where to apply this seam finish. And other than sewing in the darts, which I'll cover in another video, this is basically the next step after stay stitching. Start with a 2-inch or 5-centimeter wide bias strip. I've already covered cutting bias in a separate video. If you need a longer piece than what's in your pile, you will find information on how to piece bias there as well. The type of fabric you select makes a big difference in the outcome of the look of the finished seam. Very lightweight fabrics like China silk or silk habitai can be almost too stretchy on the bias for a straight seam, like a side seam. And they can actually torque and ripple when applied. I cannot stress enough, always, always test on a scrap and get a feel for how that bias strip is going to handle on the hand-woven fabric in front of you. I can apply this seam finish in my sleep, but I still test it on a scrap of fabric before I proceed, and then I can adjust how it feeds. If I see the bias strip is torquing, I can take some of the excess stretch out of the bias before proceeding. So here, this lightweight cotton, some of the excess stretch needs to be taken out of the bias strip. So what I'm doing is placing the iron at the front end, and as I am pressing, I am pulling slightly to take out some of that extra give. It is still a bias strip, and it will still stretch and mold over an edge, but without as much stretch as it had initially, which is what causes some of the torquing when applied. I'll begin with the shoulders. Though the seam allowance in my patterns is 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters, I don't want to cover all the seam allowance with the bias. I recommend a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter to a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance when applying the bias. Your presser foot can be a great tool if it falls within this range for keeping those bound edges all consistent. Now, because my straight stitch presser foot is 3/8 inch wide from the needle to the edge of the presser foot, I'll use it to create a 3/8 inch seam allowance when applying my binding. You'll notice that I have not pinned the binding in place. This allows the binding to ease onto the garment. I usually tug slightly to make sure that it goes on smoothly without distorting the fabric underneath. So I will take my binding, right sides together, the binding and the garment, and I will use my presser foot as a guide. Don't forget to backstitch. And give the binding just a slight tug as you apply it. Once you've applied the binding to the edge of the fabric, carefully press the binding away from the garment. Most people who make garments regularly know the term stitch in the ditch. but I find often that hand weavers don't know what that means. Once the binding is pressed away from the garment, there is a small indentation or ditch at the edge of the binding where it meets the fabric. From the right side, begin to wrap the binding around to the wrong side, securing with a pin just to get it started. Once in the machine, line up the needle with the ditch and begin sewing with normal stitches right along that ditch. The stitching will be basically invisible. Wrap the binding snug around the cut edge of the garment, staying just a couple of inches ahead of the presser foot. You're going to wrap the binding snug around the cut edge of the garment, staying just a couple inches ahead of the presser foot. This is important because a tight wrap is critical here. Since this binding is applied before the seam is sewn, the failure to wrap tight against the cut edge of the garment section will yield inaccurate results once the seam is sewn, because you can no longer tell where the 5/8 inch seam line is. Give the seam finish a final pressing. Carefully trim the excess binding from the back. Yes, I know this is a raw edge, but because of the nature of how grain lines are situated, bias doesn't ravel. Once the seam is sewn and pressed open, the raw edge of the bias won't be visible. One more thing to explain. I'm about to apply the bias to the other side seam. And of course, I have to apply the bias right sides together with the garment section. If you watched my video on finishing the edges, I made a really big deal about which direction to stitch. And if I wanted to stitch this with the binding up, highly recommended, and have the binding right sides together, and not want to play contortionist with the entire garment section stuffed under the arm of the sewing machine, I had to think this one through. I talked extensively in that video about stitching from the widest point to the narrowest point, and I mentioned it in the beginning of this video, and in this case it would be the hem to the underarm. When you have 2 layers of cloth under the presser foot, the underneath layer is being fed by feed dogs. They drop down into the throat plate of the machine, come up, grab the fabric, and move it forward. The top layer of the fabric is being skewed by the pressure of the presser foot. So in theory, the top layer of fabric is the one that controls the direction that you stitch, not the bottom layer. And in this case, the top layer is bias. And bias is the same in both directions. So Yes, you can apply the bias in whatever direction makes the most sense, but remembering that the lower layer is being stitched against the grain. Pay attention that you don't stretch it in any way. Let the machine do the work. If you are concerned, you can always stitch on the very edge of the fabric first with a straight stitch in the direction of the grain so that that edge is stable and there will be no distortion once the bias is applied. Yes, a walking foot can help. I cover that in a separate video as well. I didn't choose to use the walking foot in this video because my walking foot, built into the machine, has a presser foot that is a ½ inch wide from the needle to the edge of the presser foot. I could have used it by moving the needle in closer to the side of the presser foot, creating a 3/8 inch width, but I didn't want to complicate the video. Nothing I teach is ever simple. I jokingly say that when my children had friends over and one of them asked me a question about anything, they would jump in and say, "No, don't ask, she'll tell you." Truth is, there's a lot of physics behind garment construction, and whenever a hand-woven fabric is involved, it's important to understand the physics behind how cloth performs to get really superior results, because everything is exaggerated with a hand-woven fabric. So I try to give as much of the why as I do the how, and then knowing the why, you can think more for yourself as you create your own masterpiece. I'm Daryl Lancaster for The Weaver Sews.